All right, hi everybody, and welcome back to the English videos brought to you by me. That is National Master Mark Biernacki, and today we're going to be going over some of the main lines when Black plays pawn to e5. And I gave you guys a brief preview of this in the last video, but in this video, we're going to dive just a little bit deeper and talk about all of the ideas behind the main lines. So, one of the things that's helpful about playing the English is that basically regardless of what Black does on their first move, unless they do something silly like sacrifice a pawn or move this pawn up here, in which case we would definitely take that pawn, then we're gonna reply under my repertoire with the move knight to c3. And that goes for e5, that goes for knight f6, that goes for e6. Any move other than d5 or b5 where they're directly attacking the pawn, I guarantee you, if you play knight c3, it's going to be okay. That's the move that I play. I can pre-move that on Lichess, with like 99% confidence that I'll be all right. And so knight c3. And then the main lines of the English are the types of positions where I was describing sort of what really made me fall in love with the English, at least, are positions, Black plays knight f6, White plays knight f3, attacking the pawn on e5, Black defends the pawn with knight to c6, and then we play pawn g3 to fianchetto the bishop, and then here, Black has a decision to make, because if they want to keep the bishop outside of their pawn chain, now's the time to do that, because soon they're going to have to decide how to move this pawn, either d6 or d5, and most of the time d6, but d5 also is possible. We'll cover that a little bit later. And if they want to move bishop c5 or bishop b4, now's the time to do that. But in this video, we're going to cover the two moves, bishop to e7, and then g6, bishop g7. And so I'll talk about bishop e7 real quick here, because our plan against bishop e7 is very similar to our plan against bishop g7, except I view bishop e7 as simply an inferior move to bishop g7, because bishop g7 has at least a scope for the bishop. It has some future. The bishop on e7, not so much, because it's just going to be blocked in by the pawn, unless, of course, they're going to play d5. Then it's a perfectly normal square. But the bishop on e7 is just not as well placed as the bishop on g7 in this particular variation, where they're going d6, d6, and playing on the king side. They want the bishop sort of to be on the g7 square. So that's my brief analysis of that move. And that's legitimately all I know, so I'm keeping it real a little bit on these videos. When somebody plays bishop e7 and plays d6, I'm pretty confident. I like my position. I like my chances immediately in that game. So we'll move on to g6 here, and when they fianchetto the bishop, they opposite. They sort of mirror our fianchetto of our bishop on g2. So bishop g2. Bishop g7, this is a signature, of course, of the English opening, is getting the bishop fianchettoed on g2. I basically, in chess, because of my years playing the English, I love fianchettoed bishops, especially bishops that are fianchettoed in front of my king. Fianchetto is when you move the bishop out to the right or to the left, in this case, instead of the normal way, like moving towards the center. You move the bishop out towards the side of the board. That is the fianchetto. Moving the bishop to g2 or b2 or g7 or b7. And here bishop g2 is a signature of the English, controlling this long diagonal. This is going to be one of the most important pieces in the game for us as English players. So castle the king. Black will likely also castle the king. And then this is where the sort of plan begins. So we start out with this move c4, which is a move of a pawn on the queen side of the board. You could play d3 here, and that would be completely fine. I've played that many times myself. It sort of is just how I'm feeling that day. What I like to play, I either will play d3, or I immediately begin with my plan of pushing the pawn up the board and gaining space on the queen side by playing rook to b1. And rook to b1 essentially prepares the move b4, and then we go b5 on the next move to attack this knight, and we gain space over on the left side of the board for our pieces. We start to worry black immediately. So, like I said, d3, completely reasonable move. You could play this move. You could defend your pawn and gain a pawn chain. It's a completely fine move. You're also stopping e4 a little bit. It's a good move. It's a good move for sure. But if you want to invoke fear in your opponent, maybe you play rook b1. It looks a little bit more suspicious. Like, what is the plan behind that move? That's why I like to play it. I play maybe a little bit of emphasis. Slide the rook over. Emphasize that you're going to play b4 on the next move. All right, and so this position marks an important transition where black could either play the move a5 and stop the move pawn to b4, or they could continue with something such as d6, potentially h6, most likely d6, in which case we would play the move pawn to b4. Basically, if they don't make a move that causes a threat or stops b4, then we do it. You want to go ahead and continue with this plan of playing b4, expanding your pawns on the queen side of the board. So let's start with the move d6 here. And then we move our pawn up to b4. Here, they could play a number of moves. They could play a6, they could play bishop to e6 to threaten our pawn. Let's start with bishop f5. Here, aiming down at our rook. No worries. We can play the move pawn to d3 and block the bishop from capturing our rook. Here's an important moment where if they play the move queen d7, threatening to move the bishop down to h3, making a battery with the queen and bishop, this is one of my favorite things to do in the English. And you know, this isn't even necessarily technically the best move here, but I like to slide the rook over because this way, when they play bishop h3, I can maintain my light squared bishop, the good English bishop, slide it back to bishop on h1, and the bishop on h3 is just sort of sitting there. You always have ideas of playing knight g5 to get rid of it as well, if you want to. Okay, let's say they don't do that. Let's say they play pawn a6. Anytime a pawn move is played to stop your pawn from advancing to b5, you want to support it even more. So play the move pawn to a4. Common move here might be something like rook to b8. We could play pawn b5, breaking through. They might capture, they might not. Doesn't particularly... Actually, okay, they're probably going to capture. Knight goes back to e7. And then if you can play this move, it's almost always a good idea. Put the bishop on a3, aiming down at this diagonal where it looks like you're just aiming at an empty pawn, but you have that knight and that rook behind you. So what this does is it prepares the move pawn to c5, breaking through in the position. All right, let's go back. So that's basically your English plan. Push the pawn up to b5, and then put your bishop on a3, get that diagonal controlled, and push the pawn up to c5. All right, let's go back. So let's say this bishop had gone to e6. Similar move, but slightly different. So we played d3. And if they put their queen up to d7, notice how this light squared bishop is somewhat boxed in now. It can only go to a number of squares safely. Bishop to g4, bishop to h3, bishop to f5. Not that many squares the bishop could go to. So what we can do is we can put the knight up to g5, attack the bishop. And in this particular position, the light squared bishop is so much more valuable than the knight that it's worth taking time out here just to get rid of that bishop and sort of defeats black's purpose in the position. Black doesn't have that many goals now once we get rid of that bishop on e6. And so they could play bishop f5 and avoid it temporarily, but we're going to go e4. They could play bishop g4, avoid it even longer. We're going to play f3. And now the bishop's out of squares. Notice it can't go to h3. We got two attackers over there with a knight and the bishop. So it's got to go back to e6, and then we can capture it. Gaining the bishop pair. And a very, very good position for white. All right, that does it pretty much with this move order where they allow us to play b4. Let's now look at what if they stop it? What if they play pawn to a5? So this is slightly different, okay? Now we have to play the move pawn to a3. Again, anytime they move their a pawn, we want to kind of mimic it. So if they play a6 when our pawn's on b4, we're going to play a4 to prepare b5. If they play a5 with our pawn back on b2, we're going to play a3 to prepare b4. Because notice if we go up here now, the knight's just going to get us, right? Just going to capture our pawn. So we play a3 to prepare b4. Now black might play something like d6. Notice that the pawn move pawn to a4 is not very good in this case because we have the queen and the knight aiming at that pawn, and our knight can simply capture the pawn for free. Normally that might be like a sneaky move to sort of prevent the move b4 because of en passant, but the knight here could just capture it, and that would be a free pawn for the white pieces. So they can't stop it. They can't stop pawn b4. They're going to play something like d6 here, maybe h6, but we'll go with d6 in this case. Okay, pawn b4. They usually like to capture to gain control of the a file. Now, I'm just going to make a couple more moves for black here. Let's say they play h6. This is in line with the plan of expanding the pawns on the king side, which is what black should be doing because their pawn chain points over to the king side of the board. So now we might play d3, we might play b5. Doesn't particularly matter. Those are going to be basically your next two moves no matter what. You want to get this pawn chain solidified. Let's just go with d3 in this case. Okay, I'm going to set up a trap actually for black. So knight h5. Now we move our pawn up to b5, attacking the knight on c6. The knight goes back to e7. And then here's where you always want to look out for a trap. So this isn't necessarily the best example of this, but I want to point this out. So let's say that we had wasted two moves in a row here. You want to always watch out when this knight's on h5 and this bishop's on g7. The knight's out of the way of the bishop. You want to always watch out for this bishop aiming down at the knight and make sure you have ample support of the knight. Because if you don't, then they can play this move pawn to e4. Looks like a move that's not safe because we have plenty of attackers, but if we capture that pawn, they're going to take our knight over on c3. So I have to point this trap out because it happens far too often. So you want to watch out. If they have their pawn up on f5, their knight is not on f6, their bishop's aiming down at the knight, you got to watch out for this e4 move. Too often, it happens to me even sometimes in blitz games. I'll just be not paying attention, and then all of a sudden my knight on c3 is hanging. I lose a piece, and I lose the game. So you gotta watch out for your knight hanging on c3. Just thought I'd throw that in there. This isn't necessarily the best example, but it can happen. It can happen. So back to the current position. When you can't put your bishop on a3, and this is an example of that kind of position because the rook is aiming down at the a file. What you want to do is play bishop to b2. Black might play a move like this. Slide our queen up to b3. Or even c2 is possible as well. They're going to keep playing normal moves. And now we fight for control of the a file by putting our rook over on a1. And we have our f rook supporting it. And notice that in all English endgames with these c4, e5 positions where black's bishop develops to g7 or e7, typically white has the better endgame because there are these weak pawns down here on b7 and c7 that because of our spatial advantage on the queen side, we are privy to attack. We have pieces that are ready to jump into the action. We have this bishop that's always aiming down at the b7 pawn. There's always tactics where this diagonal gets opened up and the bishop on g2 could be attacking the rook. This is kind of the position that I dream of. Sometimes I lay in my bed and I dream of this position. I think of this position. So this is my English repertoire against bishop g7 and e7 when black plays e5. And I look forward to seeing you guys in the next video.